But thank you both, Bangani and Nicholas. This has been an excellent presentation, albeit quite tech focused, but certainly helped us to understand much better what happens on the back end. But I think it also leads us well into our next session on self-sovereign identity, also looking at how we can actually position choice and control over data and privacy. So in this case, we normally look at big data sitting on a company or organization's database, whereas with self-sovereign identity, we're looking at ownership of data. So thank you for that. And I'm going to now go into the next session where I introduce Barbra Dale Jones, who's going to take us through the SSI process and her discussion with her team. Welcome, Barbra. Barbra is one of the directors of the Field Institute, a global statutory consultancy and digital leadership training institution. She's also the director of both Thunder Bay Collective, a reseller and implementation agent of disruptive software, and Rocket School, which delivers a groundbreaking and innovative extracurricular program for children, capacitating them to thrive in tomorrow's world of work. Now, you can hear Barbra's passion around this and experiences in the field of education, as well as now innovation. And she serves on the advisory board as an associate of Jet Education Services in the PSET Cloud program. We work very closely. And it's always such an honor to hear you, Barbra, and where you share your ideas and thoughts with us. Barbra holds an MA degree in English literature. She also has a deep interest in reading, hiking, and playing the violin. That's something I didn't know about, Barbra. So welcome, and over to you and your team. Thank you.
Thanks, Roxana, so much, and greetings, colleagues. It's good to be able to talk to you today about self-sovereign identity, which, yes, is another technology. And so, as Roxana says, builds on well from what Nicola has been saying. But it's more than just a technology. It's a protocol and it's a standard that allows for enormous disruption broadly in the global economy. We're going to talk a little bit to that today, but we're also going to narrow our focus around self-sovereign identity to its use and relevance to education broadly, and then the use that the PSET Cloud project is making. We have three speakers today, all of whom are experts in self-sovereign identity, and I'll get to that just now, but just to set the scene a little bit and say that self-sovereign identity is a new model of digital identity. It's a decentralized identity protocol which sees individuals now managing their digital identities and controlling what others need to verify about them, including data about their education, training, skills, projects, job history, assessments, competencies, and so on. There are many, many benefits to self-sovereign identity. It removes many pain points and administrative frustrations. It enhances privacy. It almost entirely removes the risk of fraud. It enables the mobility and portability of learning in much more dynamic and immediate ways. And as I said earlier, it also has the opportunity to transform not just systems like education, but other ones like health, the global economy, banking, insurance, and so on. We're seeing major innovation taking place using self-sovereign identity at the moment. So our three speakers, I will give more detail on each of them as each of them is about to speak, but just to paint a broad picture. The first speaker is Beth Havinga, normally based in Berlin in Germany, but currently in Darwin in Australia. And she's the MD of the EdSafe AI Alliance and the European EdTech Alliance. And she's going to be setting the stage for us today. She's going to be talking about what it's like to control your own data and your digital identity. She's going to talk about interoperability, and she's going to talk about some of the international use cases where SSI is being utilized. And she will describe not just a technology at play, but major movements that are taking place in education and more broadly. She'll be followed by Karel de Jager here in South Africa, the MD of Chain Ops, a blockchain expert, and he's going to talk about the principles and technologies of self-sovereign identity. And then our third speaker will be Lohan Spies, who's an entrepreneur and SSI thought leader. He's an ex officio board member of the Sovereign Foundation, very, very deeply knowledgeable about the use of self-sovereign identity. And he's actually built a platform for UNICEF, which he's going to talk about today. But he's also going to talk about how self-sovereign identity is going to be used for the PSET cloud in South Africa. So that's the sequence for today, and these are the three speakers. I'm looking forward to their inputs. We'll give each of them about 15 minutes to speak, but I encourage you to put your questions into the chat, and we will take questions between each of the speakers. But they will each give an uninterrupted input before we take questions and answers. So to our first speaker, who's Beth Havinga, as I said, currently in Darwin in Australia, quite late at night for her right now. She is the MD, as I said, of the EdSafe AI Alliance and also the European EdTech Alliance. She was previously managing director of the German Alliance for Education. And most recently, she served on the special board of the Federal Ministry of Science, Research and Economics in Austria as an expert in the field of digitalization and apprenticeships. She's also served as a member of the platform Digital Future, Learning, Researching Knowledge of the German Digital Summit by invitation of the German Federal Minister for Education. She's currently chair of the advisory board of Kids DigiLab Berlin. So there's enormous experience here in developing the use of technology, interoperability standards frameworks. She's represented Germany broadly in Europe and seen a lot of innovation in education. So without further ado, let me hand over to Beth to set the scene for our discussion today. Over to you, Beth.
Thank you so much. Look, self-sovereign identity sounds really technical. So we're going to start out today by unpacking some of what this topic means and then how it fits into the general trends and developing possibilities. Right now, we use a number of sources and platforms to identify and authorize us. Often we use these because they make things easier or more streamlined. We've all seen the buttons that say sign in with Google or with your Apple ID, sign in with Facebook, use Amazon to pay things. These platforms use a login that's already been vetted, so they already have all of your information, and that allows you to be verified quickly through that platform. And this sounds great a lot of the time. One less password to remember, one less system to sign up to. You already know how they work. However, we're definitely exchanging something for this ease of access, and that something is our data. Whenever a new product comes to market, there's a period of research and development, and a key component of this is market research. What kind of users like the product? How do they interact with it? By following a user's movements through the internet and accompanying them through their use of various platforms, these larger verifying organizations are amassing massive amounts of user data, which will increasingly be of interest to any company wanting to develop something new or optimize something existing. Where do the customers click? What happens after they leave your site? Do they all interact with similar services, have similar desires? What happens if certain things are recommended to them? Whilst we may not feel like we're directly selling our information, the fact is that these systems are offered because they're getting something in return. They're gathering data on all of us all the time. And we mostly accept this because of the ease of access and streamlined processes. I want to give a small example. At the moment, it's kind of like we want to participate in a book club. We've read the book, we have a ton to say about it, we want to meet the other readers and have a discussion, but there's a big gate in front of the building. And 4 big bouncers are out the front. Each of them wants us to prove we've read the book. So one of them wants to look in our bag, one of them wants to look in the book and see if we've written notes in the corners, one of them wants to see if we've taken notes in another book. Each one of them wants us to show them a special membership card. And if we don't have that, we have to fill out a long document with lots of personal information. So finally, we're in. And these bouncers, they come in too. Some of them listen to our conversations. Some of them are recommending other books we might like. Others suggest that we really need a good reading lamp or a book bag to go along with that book. Decentralized systems, including self-sovereign identity, which we'll be talking about today, mean that instead of processes like that, or instead of your information and your authentication data sitting solely with one organization or one bouncer, one company, you own the use of that data and determine where it gets implemented. Thinking about the book club example, it would be like getting to that gate and seeing other members of the club that you know. Some of them you've seen before. They've interacted with you. They've heard your take on something, and they can verify that you're you. Or they can verify that you've been to that club before because of a unique identifier you have, kind of like a fingerprint. Some others have only had access to the meetings of the last meeting, so they know you've been there because it's written down. The key point of self-sovereign identity is that it provides a greater degree of flexibility, privacy, and security around the use of the data, and that you own this data and all of the processes that surround it. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Great. So we're going to look at some of the trends around this. The decentralization of systems seems to be increasing in a number of different areas. You've probably all heard of concepts like cryptocurrency, NFTs, the metaverse. It's been really hard to read the news in the past years without these being mentioned. And these concepts and technologies behind them are gaining momentum and growing large communities around their use. These concepts have been of great interest because of their financial value, but let's see how we got there. There have been a number of developments in the way that we use, work, and interact with the internet. We started out creating really simple information sites that could be found and consumed. That's Web 1. It was about sharing information. Web 2 is the current system we're using right now, which has enabled all kinds of communication tools and interconnectivity systems and services. Web 2 has lent really heavily on those centralized infrastructures and organizations to support our activities. So things like those login and authentication processes. Looking to current and future developments, so Web 3, however, we see that these concepts are becoming more decentralized. Web 3 is being developed using infrastructures like blockchain to support the verification of transactions or determine the individual ownership of specific items or intellectual property. To paraphrase Scott Meyer's work in this field, Web 3 essentially refers to distributing the ecosystem of technology so that the next generation of virtual engagement can be properly supported. It also provides us with really exciting opportunities for furthering digital equity and equitable environments, and empowering all humans to have access to meaningful situations, which can, in turn, enhance their own development and possibilities. So what does this mean for education? We can align the developments that we've been seeing in education with the developments of Web 1, 2, and 3. Essentially, we're moving towards an education ecosystem in which learners are taking control of and owning their education. This means that learners are choosing skill sets and competencies they would like to develop, things that they're interested in or show proficiency in, and are seeking out learning environments that match their needs. We're also seeing an increase in learners validating their knowledge through decentralized systems and no longer necessarily relying on the centralized platforms or education institutions to validate or verify their learning. In this way, we can see the changes in education accreditation over time. We see that Ed 1 was all about knowledge transfer being provided by accredited institutions. There are things like universities, high schools, vocational colleges. We see that Ed 2, where we're currently right now, was about centralized platforms distributing that education, things like Udemy, Skillshare, OutSchool, among a whole bunch of other platforms, still maintaining that idea of really centralized systems and services. And where we're seeing a lot of the development heading at the moment is towards Ed 3, where individuals can gather skills from multiple different sources, multiple different platforms, and validate that knowledge by having that data that they can present in their own profile or wallet, some kind of system like that. So why education? Why is this important for the way we're designing our education systems? Less than 7% of the world's population has a college education. So less than 7% of the entire world's population has, for whatever reason, made use of one of those centralized education institutional offerings to receive their further education. There are hurdles of access, of funding, but there's also an increasing feeling over the past years that the systems are wildly outdated or not delivering some of the core skills that learners need to acquire. The pace of change digitally is so fast at the moment that most people are requiring ongoing training and further professional development just to maintain their current jobs, let alone move into new positions. This can mean that at the end of a degree, the skills that learners have gained are already out of date or need to be built on. However, the idea of using centralized systems or institutions to verify whether or not someone is fit for a certain job or to access a certain role, so the need for a degree, that still remains pivotal to our current education and employment systems. In fact, students in the United States are unable to apply for 65% of all available jobs if they only have a high school diploma and no verification from university in the form of a degree. So somehow this idea of centralized verification of skills seems to be moving further and further away from the reality of our education needs. In fact, 375 million people have to reskill or upskill by 2030. The required skill sets and competencies are small units of knowledge, and they can't be covered by traditional learning institutions or longer degrees. And already governments and companies are struggling to find good solutions to offer accredited and meaningful learning opportunities so that these skills deficits can be bridged. One of the hurdles is also finding systems that can accommodate the requirements of the learners and the educators in the old thinking models that are there. The past 2 years of teaching and learning during a pandemic have shown us that digital equity is one of the largest hurdles to providing meaningful learning opportunities. Equity encompasses so many parts of a future thinking education system, from digital foundations to conditions for learning, meaningful learning situations, providing access to digital technologies, and also digital literacy skills. And if we believe that every child deserves a fair chance to get the education they need to live a productive and healthy life, then our educational systems must be redesigned to provide that chance. This means rethinking the idea of centralized physical institutions, which are not least prohibitive because of location and affordability. And indeed, the questions of a location can have far-reaching consequences if all our learners must leave their communities and family structures in order to achieve required learning goals. Learning is happening everywhere and all of the time. We read articles, work through small programs, teach ourselves new skills, watch videos telling us how to do that one tricky thing we haven't quite managed yet. The ideas behind Ed3 reflect some of these concepts and the possibilities for future thinking education systems to truly reflect the development of all skills, and especially required skills, to verify the acquisition of competencies needed for specific tasks, instead of just marking the milestone of a degree. What can this look like in practice then? So some of the trends and possibilities we're seeing globally are the creation of DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations. These are new ways to organize work and learning. And they're learning communities, but more than that, they're groups which will enable learners to co-own and collectively govern their learning opportunities, working together on syllabi, working together on the development and implementation of the curricula, really working towards skills and competencies that they want to be learning and where there's a need at the moment in the market. A key part of this is also that there can be possibilities for incentives through these communities for both learners and teachers. A lot of these look at tokens or competency-based models. A really good example here is a site called Rabbit Hole, which is a community of lifelong learners and educators working together to guide people through their Web3 journey, to help develop crypto projects and find and engage contributors. So the way that this works is it educates a lot of people. They get tokens or incentives for being able to work through specific points of their education. They also then get to work on and build specific projects through which they gain a lot of extra experience and expertise, and also have the possibility of working further on these projects or at other projects with other employers. This specific platform incentivized with tokens through proof of use. So if they were actually being able to set up a site as one of the examples of a task, or if they were able to build a specific component of a project. And excitingly here, because the tokens could also be monetized, learners were able to earn really well, attain recognized and verified skills, competencies, and qualifications, which helped them with further work opportunities. But the thing that excites me the most is that the majority of all of the learners on this site came from areas where digital equity has been really low, or communities were really disadvantaged. These were people who otherwise would have had to leave their communities to go and find education possibilities or find other work, and where there were no local solutions. So this means education opportunities like this can open brand new doors to learners globally, and no longer make location and financial issues an exclusion criteria for the attainment of skills. There's some other really exciting ideas around this. There's things like Invisible College, which is also working on sort of Web3 skills to provide sort of a network and opportunities to help make impact. But there's also learning communities based around things like graphic design, around any kind of financial skills. And I think it's an exciting opportunity that we're seeing, so that you can be anywhere accessing learning opportunities that are providing you not only with tokens, but financial incentives to achieve the learning goals, providing you with experience, verifiable experience that you can then take with you through your learning and then also work journey, so that you can have those skills validated and supporting your development. A last trend that I'm seeing globally at the moment is the development of a learner wallet or passport profile. There's a whole bunch of different terms for this around the world, depending on where we are. And it's one of the most common use cases for self-sovereign identity that I'm seeing at the moment. This is a way to bring together all of the competencies, achievements, successes in a meaningful way, so that admissions boards, future employers, and membership-based organizations can get a more targeted and holistic view of the person or learner. As I said, there's multiple different names for this, and they all have slightly different takes on profile or wallet or system or passport. And so this has been looking into a way to visualize our opportunity where all of your data sits firmly in your wallet and cannot be accessed without your permission by other systems, where essentially you as a learner, you as an educator, hold the key to bring all those little pieces together of the certification documents that you can then present back out. I'm going to wind up with looking at the time, and I'm really excited to hear all of the possibilities around the idea of decentralized systems and what that can look like then for our education systems.
Thanks so much, Beth. I think in the last 30 seconds or so, the system froze. Can I just confirm whether people are able to hear and the vision of the PSET cloud? His question is, are we ready for this as a country? It might be an unfair question to ask you, so I'm going to wait to hear from both Carl and Lohan before we come back to that question later. But thanks so much, Beth. And now we're going to turn to Carl. So as I said earlier, Carl de Jager is the MD of ChainOps, which is a software development company specializing in blockchain applications. But he started his career as a chemical engineer in the energy industry and has also worked for many years in the training space, specifically working with blockchain training. He's worked as a consultant at the Blockchain Academy since 2017, coached a number of executives on technologies that the blockchain provides to law firms, insurance providers, commercial banks, both locally and abroad. I personally have experienced his training. He's passionate, he's deeply knowledgeable, and it's into his safe hands that I put you for the next section of this, which is looking at the fundamental technology of the blockchain and how this allows for self-sovereign identity. So he's going to talk about the the protocols, the principles, the technologies. Thanks, Carl, over to you.
Thank you for that compliment, Barbara. Right, I'm going to define identity as well. I think Beth did an excellent job in giving us some real-world examples. I'm going to give you a little bit more of an abstract view on the technology. So I first want to ask the question, what is an identity, and what do we mean when we talk about identity? Actual fractals of attributes, and I'd say on the two outermost extreme ends of identity is our personal feelings, our relationships, our desires and thoughts. And then on the other end of this spectrum is a random number issued by the government in the form of our government identity number. And perhaps even a little bit more simple than that and trivial is a Bitcoin private key, which is a layer on top of a cryptocurrency blockchain in which you need to interact with this blockchain. And Beth has also shown us a few of these decentralized autonomous organizations. And that's typically the permissionless nature that you referred to, and that's the identity layer that you need to interact with these systems. And I'll come back to that in a couple of slides. So every product or service that we procure in our life, every time we interact with the global economy, we need a form of identity. And that form of identity sits somewhere on the spectrum. When you register, for instance, at a university, you need a government ID, you perhaps need a proof of residence, you need some demographic information, and perhaps historic academic results. If you go to a doctor, you also require your customer information, KYC information, and perhaps a medical record, at least verbally, of your health. Now, when you present these documents or these proofs to an entity that requests it, the acceptance thereof is dependent on a trust relationship between the issuer and the verifier, or in this case, the requester. For instance, if you present your ID document to a bank, when you try to open a bank account, the bank needs to trust that the government issued that document, and also that they are maintaining their database of IDs in such a way that no one can hack into it or create a bunch of fraudulent identities, for example. And on top of that, perhaps more importantly, there's a general assumption that it will stay this way, that trust will be will also be valid in the future. So the government would remain trusted in future, and if this trust breaks down, let's say next year, then the system collapses, and the owner of that identity will probably lose access to the products or services that he procured at that time. Or at the very least, compliance will be threatened. So this trust relationship exists in almost everything we do. Perhaps another more fitting example for this conference would be the issuing of a certificate by a trading provider like a university. So if a graduate applies for a job sometime after receiving his or her degree, the prospective employer needs to trust that the university was honest in its intended purposes of issuing that credential. And if the university needs to remain trusted for as long as that credential is in use, let's say the university becomes rogue a decade after issuing that credential. Then if a person or a prospective employee applies for a new job at that time, you would struggle to convince this employer that his historic degree, let's say the degree is 10 years old, is still legitimate, because that university or that institution is not trusted anymore. And then therefore there is no way for the employer to actually verify that claim, because that database of the university might not exist anymore, or it might be corrupted. So there's countless of examples like this that affect our life every single day. So that's the little diagram that you see there. There's always that trust relationship between the verifier and the issuer. And we've actually seen a breakdown of this trust just this weekend with the Russian government websites, and I assume the Ukrainian government websites as well, suffering disruptions. And so now there's a break in trust. So any citizen of these two countries that needs to prove his or her identity will have trouble doing so, because that trust relationship is crumbling. So I also want to focus a little bit on this report on the right of my screen, which is a World Bank Remittance report of 2018. Now, I'm specifically mentioning this 2018 one because the World Bank was quite explicit in pointing to the reasons for a decline in bank accounts. So can you believe that? So in this day and age, with this technological revolutions that we currently experience, there's fewer bank accounts this year than there was last year. And it stated that remittance costs specifically are also skyrocketing, and the main reason for this is identity. Okay, financial services opt for rather declining clients that pose a risk towards KYC requirements, as these KYC and AML terrorist financing requirements are getting stricter every year. So, you can just imagine. I also found some consensus around the cost of a KYC check in South Africa that ranges from around 180 to 1,800 Rand per customer in South Africa, depending on whether that is an individual or a corporation. So you can just imagine that a bank that has a walk-in client.
Sorry, can I interrupt
Yes.
a little bit, please? We can't really see your slides. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Oh, no.
Thinking?
That's an issue.
Sorry about that.
Am I sharing the wrong screen?
We see you.
We can see it now, Carl.
Now. Thank you very much, Carl. Thanks, Barbara.
Apologies for that. So there's all the things that I was referring to. In the previous slide, you will see that there's the trust relationship that I was referring to. All right. So this World Bank remittance report states that a bank would rather show a prospective client the door than take on a risk of non-KYC compliance. And you can understand that because other than heavy fines for not complying to existing regulations, there's also a cost of between 180 and 1,800 Rand to verify a client's identity based on whether that is an individual or a corporation. So, we are disenfranchising billions of people every year because of these stringent regulations. And it's all because our existing systems and our existing identifiable systems is fragile. There's more than 1 billion adults in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia alone that do not have proper identities. And if you include residence data to that, then that number also skyrockets. So it's really a massive barrier to global economic growth. And I would say that if we can solve this problem, there's a strong argument to be made that would be a massive catalyst to global economic growth that might even alleviate poverty entirely and make it something of the past. And it would be at least, if not bigger, of a revolution than the World Wide Web. So what is the solution? Well, the solution was presented to us, or at least one of the tools that we need for this solution was created in 2008. And in 2009, we saw the birth of the first blockchain, and that is the Bitcoin blockchain on 3rd of January, which is an append-only database. It's a permissionless, decentralized database that has no authority. It has no administrators, and it's 100% accurate. All right. It sounds like magic, and it's because it is magic. It's quite amazing. And this append-only database is completely transparent as well. And there's an identity layer on top of this database which you need to write to it. And if we figure out shortly after the discovery of this technology that if we can connect this identity layer that you need to interact with this blockchain to identities in the real world, then we can give birth to a new concept. And this concept is called self-sovereign identity. So, and it turns out it's actually not that difficult to achieve. This concept of self-sovereign identity allows a user to record and manage his own identity and be fully in control of that without needing to trust any third parties. So the trust relationship, the one that I showed you earlier, which you quickly saw, is now flattened and it becomes completely decentralized, and therefore all single points of failure are also eliminated. So now a requester that seeks to verify identifiable information or credentials from another entity only needs to have trusted the issuer at the time at which the credential was created. So there's no need to trust the issuer at the current time. There's also no need for the issuer to keep that information. It can be deleted or it can be lost forever. Now, this attribute also limits the ability of issuers and verifiers to hoard and monetize personal information. Beth also alluded to that, to the Facebooks and the Googles of our time, which uses our identity and creates a gold mine out of that. So in this case, on a self-sovereign identity solution, the user is fully in control of his or her own identity, and a user can even monetize his or own identity and data, and therefore reap the benefits of that. If the solution is designed correctly, privacy can be preserved, but a user can still build reputations. The user will be able to manage his own data, but not able to lose access to it. So that's quite cool. It will be free or cheap to use, and it will be permissionless, which means that all barriers to entry that we listed earlier is removed. This protocol does not distinguish between social class, race, religion, or even, it doesn't even care if you're a human or a machine, because machines also need identity more and more. Apart from minimizing fraud and breaking down barriers, it will also enable the advancement of new technological revolutions like virtual worlds, self-sovereignty, globalization, and digital asset management. So SSI, self-sovereign identity, is an elegant solution that can be used in parallel with conventional systems. This is also an important point. So it causes little to no disruption to our conventional systems and that we're so used to already. It can be scaled linearly, which means that you can build a small pilot project that aims for compliance today even, and scale that up as time and technology becomes more available. So I encourage you to experiment with this technology, attend a course with us at the Academy, at the Blockchain Academy, in which we unravel this technology from first principles. Or, if you are a little bit more adventurous than that, then build a pilot and experience the technology for yourself. Thank you.
Carl, thanks so much for that. A couple of questions in the chat for you. One is, someone asks, when one joins a club through a platform or some other means without prior vetting by others, is one not in essence giving one's data in some form to another? What is the self-sovereignty in the kind of interaction being described? Are we talking self-sovereignty or decentralization? So that's one question. And then another one from James Keevy. How can self-sovereign identity be used across South African Qualifications Authority, the Quality Councils, and the education and training providers?
All right, let me start with the first one. So fundamentally, yes, data can still be audited, but it's not a requirement anymore for a system to function or for a process to function. So if you look at something like Facebook, for instance, Facebook cannot work without holding and keeping your identity. The system cannot work, all right? So there's no way, there's no model for Facebook to function or for Google to function in a self-sovereign way, or at least in a way in which you keep your data, not in the current, not in the way that the current business model is structured. Self-sovereign identity enables you fundamentally to change that business model, turn it on its head, and allows you to keep your own data. So if it is designed correctly and the policies and implementation is also correct, then it enables you to do everything that you do today, interacting with the web in the same way you do today. Very little difference between the two, but no one keeps your data. No one needs to hold it for the system to work. So that's where the differentiation is. I didn't really get the question about permissionless or decentralization, but on James' question, I think the lowest hanging fruit is definitely certification. I think that's, and as I said, this compliance today, limited compliance to only the aspects that you want to reach compliance with in your business. And it will really have limited disruption. I think the biggest barrier is the network effect, is getting all the stakeholders and role players involved in adopting this technology, because it doesn't help you only have a single person accepting or using it. You need to have it far and wide adopted. And therefore you need the key players in South Africa, like the CEDAs, and the education system, which is very, formally organized, so you need a big industry like that in order to bootstrap this technology. And once you have someone big on board, then the network effects solve for themselves. That's the first domino, and then the rest will fall into place as time goes on. So pilot, to summarize, pilot the project, pilot it, and then get a big stakeholder involved that has connections to many others, and then roll it out in parallel to existing systems.
Thanks, Carl. So the issue of trust is coming up in the chat, and I know you've spoken to trust, but maybe if you can just go back and talk to this. One question is, trust in the digital environment is always an issue. How can citizens be assured that indeed they have full control of their identity? Another question earlier on is, how do you overcome the commoditization of data by central authorities? Could you talk to those two questions?
Yeah, so I see the trust takes a completely different form in this case. I mean, in this case, you don't trust necessarily anyone, which is a lot more robust. In our current system and the way that identity is currently structured and the way that we use it, there's a whole lot of fragile trust involved. For instance, as I mentioned, if you have a credential and was issued, then you know that institution needs to be trusted forever. Otherwise, that credential becomes invalid. The trust that we put in our governments is incredibly fragile. We know that our governments are not the best or not the most efficient entities in the world. You know, so that trust is always fragile, and you know, so all of that trust is removed and it's made incredibly robust because you, the individual, is then in control of your own data. There are now new elements of trust. For instance, you need to trust yourself. in some cases, not always, but in some cases, you need to trust yourself to actually preserve that data and not lose it. If you don't use, I mean, there's some social engineering solutions to that as well, which you can implement to prevent that. But in some cases, you're going to have to trust yourself. And you know, so it takes a little bit of a different form, but it's much better. It is way, way better, like orders of magnitude. So that's the first thing. And the other thing is, I think you alluded to again to the monetization of data, which that question. And as I said, it doesn't prevent it. It doesn't prevent big corporates from hoarding your data and taking that. But that's, you know, the industry is not dependent on that, you know. So it can still function without that ability. And that then all comes down, if you don't know whether they're doing that or not, that comes down to open source software. And, you know, in that, you know, software that's properly reviewed. And if you use software, for instance, and you want to know whether that software is, or that software takes your data and hoards it and monetizes it in future, then, you know, you're going to, there's a little bit of a technical process in which you're going to trust others to review the back end of that software and tell you whether that's happening or not.
Carl, thanks very much. I'm going to move us on to our third and final speaker, who is Lohan Spies. Lohan has been a co-founder of various cybersecurity and self-sovereign identity ventures. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's a self-sovereign identity thought leader. He's actually built a self-sovereign identity platform that he's going to talk to you a bit about today. Like entrepreneurs do, he finds motivation in building startups that leverage exponential technologies and decentralized trust networks. He's an ex officio Sovereign Foundation board member and trustee. He's the chair of the Sovereign Steward Council and actively involved in various initiatives to further the adoption of SSI in South Africa and Africa. And one of those initiatives is the PSET Cloud itself, and he's working with us to implement SSI protocol in the project. So Lohan, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Barbara mentioned, I'll take you over, provide you some context and an overview of the protocol that we developed and how that can be leveraged pretty much for any type of self-sovereign identity project, not necessarily based in the education space. Then I'll actually show you a brief example of how we applied the technology stack in a specific project already with the YOMA project. I'll give you some brief background around that. And then we'll dive into some kind of the key things that will be required to actually get a self-sovereign identity ecosystem off the ground, and what are the common challenges, pitfalls, and what are the kind of the biggest stumbling blocks to really get this to scale. So for the YOMA project, which I'll show you a bit later, we embarked on developing a platform that are fundamentally based around the concept of self-sovereign identity. So imagine all the participants in this ecosystem. They can be learning providers, they can be employment providers, it can be the youth, or it can even be sustainable development related initiatives. But everyone in this ecosystem basically gets a self-sovereign identity, and that is the premise from which they interact with other ecosystem players within the environment. So what we've built is effectively an open source technology stack top to bottom. And the objective there is for anybody to be able to use it and leverage it across a multitude of different use cases. And the how can I say, the guiding principles that we followed when we developed this, it must be open source so that everybody can utilize it, first of all. We want to basically foster and unlock the value of open data. Now, when I say open data, it is not like, hey, you know what, we will make all the data available for everyone. It is just that the data in the system is accessible, but it is only accessible under the explicit consent of the holder of the data. So if you kind of revert back to Carl's diagram of the issuer, holder, and the verifier, an issuer will issue a credential to someone, and then the holder, which will be the person receiving that credential, can decide with whom they share it and under what terms and conditions. So open data is very important from a sharing perspective, as long as it is done from a mechanism where the holder of the identity explicitly consent for their data to move. Then the third guiding principle that we developed, or the last two, is basically open access, meaning we need to design a system that is accessible for everyone and by everyone. It should not be a system that demands that you must have a smartphone, you must have access to data, or internet, or airtime. It is basically a system that should cater for everybody's needs. And we started to design the protocols is basically from a lowest common denominator. What is our lowest user requirements to be able to utilize something like a SSI technology? And to solve that problem, what we did is we actually implemented the Custodial Solution. So it is a software as a service platform where everybody gets their identities, but they're still under full control over their data and how they share that information. And the reason being because that allows us to provide access and usage of the platform that utilize SSI technology for people that only have feature phones. It can potentially be for people without internet access. And if you go down to that level of utilization of SSI, it becomes actually very complicated because the norm is we assume you have some digital enablement, but that's not always the case. Then the two other components that we've built into the platform is, if you look at self-sovereign technology, on the one side, you have the concept of technology, and that's fine. We can build the technology, you can implement the technology, but when it comes to self-sovereign identity specifically, you need two sides of the same coin. On the one side, you need technology, and on the other side, you need governance. And the governance is a key enabler and a mechanism to really make sure technology works as expected and according to the rules and the guidelines of an ecosystem. And an ecosystem can be education, it can be health, it can be financial services. There are many different versions of how you can apply SSI across a myriad of different use cases. Then another component that we built into this technology stack is, like Beth mentioned when she started, is you can actually utilize this technology to log in. So we also implemented the capability for single sign-on, so you can seamlessly and efficiently roam across the whole ecosystem without the need to recreate usernames, recreate passwords, and to basically be able to onboard to different platforms with a click. So let me share my screen and I can show you an example of how we implemented this in the context of Yorma and where we are today. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay. So Yorma is basically an ecosystem that are built together with a lot of different organizations. So UNICEF is basically where this whole concept kind of came out from an ideation process that we've gone through with the youth across Africa. So this project is really built for the youth and by the youth. And the objective of this project is basically to utilize the concept of self-sovereign identity and then to provide the youth with three different, we call them three different dimensions. One is impact, grow, and thrive. And the way we do this is, I'm going to give you like a very simple example. So this is just my account. There's nothing magical in this account. It's a very basic account. But as soon as I log into this platform and I create an account, effectively I have a self-sovereign identity. So that self-sovereign identity is my identity, and my all the data in this identity is mine, and I decide what I share with whom. So once you have your identity, we provide you with, we expose you to different types of opportunities. So all these are different learning opportunities. And as soon as you want to go and say, okay, fine, you know, I'm interested in participating in one, you can actually go to the opportunity. But as you can see here, and this is a very important part of identity or self-sovereign identity, is we don't need to recreate value that is existing. So as example, when I participate in this opportunity, I'll actually go to the opportunity site, and I'll do the opportunity on the learning provider website. And once I could successfully complete this opportunity, I will then be issued with a verifiable credential. And a verifiable credential is basically a piece of data that says you successfully participated in this learning opportunity, and here is a verifiable credential to prove that you finished that opportunity. And then what we also do is we incentivize the youth with tokens. So once they get this verifiable credential, they can also get tokens. And this is how they build up a digital verifiable CV within this ecosystem. And then the tokens is basically an incentive for completing learning tasks. And then the youth can utilize these tokens that they receive on a platform, on the marketplace, where they can go and buy data, they can buy airtime. In South Africa, they can even go to ShopRite and buy food with this token. And everybody in this ecosystem is basically driven from the concept of, they start off with a self-sovereign identity wallet. And just to give you an idea, so we have about 40,000 youth in the platform. They are from 112 countries around the world. And from a reward perspective, we distributed nearly $173,000 of rewards to youth in this platform. And you can see from how many jobs and the qualification, etc., we already generated in this platform. And this is still in the minimum viable product. So we're only going to launch the official production version of this later this year. So that is just a kind of a brief overview of Yorma and how this technology can actually be applied in the learning or educational sector to really make change at scale. And a few examples of other projects around the world that are using the same technology in the education sector. So PZ Cloud will be one of them. Yorma will be one of them. The Ministry of Education in Ethiopia basically wants to make the whole education system credential-based. The Kenya government is extremely interested in the same, utilizing the same technology. And then we also get these a bit more bigger but purpose-built SSI-based solutions in the educational sector, like the Velocity Network. And I think when you look at SSI, education is by far the most applied industry vertical for this technology at this stage. It is by far actually outnumbering anything else when it comes to a use case, or to a use case perspective. So now that you kind of understand from a technology perspective that we can build this in an open source manner, we can build it in a way that it can be leveraged across multiple use cases. I've given you an example of how we implement it in a use case already. So let's get back to the more practical questions of how do you actually get a system like this off the ground, and what values does a system like this actually provide? So first of all, if you look at this technology and you apply it, I'm going to take the context of the PZ Cloud. What are the benefits of utilizing SSI? Well, first of all, you decentralize data, which is a very important fact, because there is no centralized database that can be, for instance, utilized in a surveillance economy, or even that can be utilized where it will exclude or include people depending on whoever feels and controls that system at any point in time. So it's a truly open system that makes sure that everybody owns and controls their data. But one of the fundamental benefits to this is number one, we can significantly reduce fraud related to fraudulent educational claims. In fact, fraudulent educational claims are actually something that are flying around in the ecosystem quite a lot. We just never know about it unless you actually go and verify the authenticity. And the other solution to that a solution like this provides is every time that someone provides you some information and you need to go and verify it, there's a very high cost in verification, and there's normally a very long process to do verification. Now that might consist of emailing to verify a credential. It might consist of phoning. There are many different ways, so it is costly and time consuming. So utilizing SSI technology, we can bring the cost of verification down significantly, and we can do it within seconds. In fact, we can do it in a sub-second manner. So as soon as I share my CV with my employer, the employer can, with a 100% guarantee, immediately verify and say, okay, the contents of this CV is actually legitimate and true. And I can go and verify it independently of the owner of that identity or the issuers of this identity. So it allows us to really create a seamless educational ecosystem where credentials can be issued and repurposed to unlock employment very, very rapidly. Another one is that we can boost the employer trust in the market significantly, as well as starting to provide a lot of verifiable insights around what is the market requirements really. Are we training too many Java developers, or what is the employment market, for instance, needing? So we can start creating these metrics in a way that it can really help the ecosystem to start. Time out.
Just 30 seconds left, and then questions.
Okay, so I think so this is effectively a POPIA compliant solution because all data is only shared with the explicit consent of the user. And then let me just kind of stop by looking at what are the key things that needs to happen for an ecosystem like this to come off the ground. Number one, we need the governance. And then number two, we really, like Carl mentioned, we need that network effect. So SSI, just like any other blockchain, is a team sport, and we need an ecosystem, and everybody must play the same game for this really to provide benefits at scale that it can. Okay, let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Lohan. A couple of questions specifically for you. One is the token generated by Yoma a crypto token? And then there's been some questions around whether it's going to be time consuming to manage one's own data. And there's also another question around the kind of reporting and compliance nightmare that education and training providers have with respect to things like BBBE, workplace skills planning, annual training reports, and so on, and whether this is addressed by SSI. So could you talk to those points very quickly? And then I'm going to ask a broader question of the whole panel, going back to the first one that was asked this morning.
Yeah, sure. So the token in Yoma is currently not a native crypto token, but our objective is to make that a native layer 1 or potentially layer 2 crypto token. We call it the universal Yoma token. And the reason being that token must be cross-border utilizable. So it is something that we are currently actively building and researching against. But the current token is provided by our labs. It's more of a permissioned a token, but it is not a pure crypto token yet. Then from a reporting perspective, when it comes to learning providers, I believe that self-sovereign identity can provide all the necessary metrics that we need, because the learning providers can, for instance, start releasing data to whoever needs that information. Like, we've trained so many Black empowered people in this specific job. And then that information can come from a verifiable fashion, from proving their identity to what credentials they issued. So we can really create a real-time system without necessarily infringing in privacy, but providing a real-time system between learning providers, government, etc., that can make this information available at the right time, so that we can really change and adapt our educational employment ecosystem to cater for the needs in the from a South African perspective. And then you had one more question, which I can't recall.
Somebody asked if it's time consuming to manage your own data.
Oh, no, not at all. So that is really a function of how the user experience is designed within the solution. But if you design it effectively, it is not time consuming. It's a click of a button. It's like I connect with an employer and the employer asks me, can you share your CV or can you share a specific credential? I decide if I want to or not. It's under my control, so I consent. And if I decide to do it, I click another button, I consent, and the data moves. So it's actually extremely simple, much more simple than what we are used to today from a paper and plastic-based credentials perspective.
Thanks very much. Time is our enemy. So I'm going to go back to the final question, which is actually the first question that was asked an hour ago by James Keevy, where he said that what Beth was saying was very well aligned to the vision of the PSET cloud. But the question is, are we ready as a country? So we've had an hour to think about that, and I'm going to now hand over to the panel for their responses. There's presumably resistance to SSI in general when SSI is applied in systems. Do you think the South African education and training system is ready for this?
I'll go first. My opinion is absolutely yes. I think the technology is not a problem anymore. We have a very good understanding of what the governance should be around a system like this. So purely from a technical and a governance perspective, we are definitely ready. I think where we are going to face a bit of pushback is where we need government support, we need ecosystem buying, and we need to have a basic understanding of what this technology really means and how to efficiently use it. I think that is going to be more the hurdling blocks, but purely from a, are we ready? In principle, we're ready. Now it is for the ecosystem and the network effects to start kicking in for us to really scale this out, because it is a team sport. The bigger the ecosystem, the more network effects, the more valuable a solution like this becomes for everybody.
Thanks, Lohan. 30 seconds, Carl and Beth. Carl first.
Yeah, we are ready. I agree with Lohan. You know, there's no technological barriers. The incentives are perfectly aligned. We need this. I think with all stakeholders, the incentives are well aligned. There might be a small barrier in terms of education, but you know, that's highly dependent also, as Lohan said, on the user interface. That, I mean, you know, what happens in the background is not supposed to be visible to the users and on all the stakeholders of this protocol. You know, so if that's properly designed, then even the educational barrier is low. So I think, you know, all the lights are green and we're definitely ready for this.
Thanks, Carl. Beth, last words.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be some pushback, especially from larger organizations, but the positives far outweigh any of the challenges that we might be facing. I think especially for a large country, especially for a country with such different perspectives for different communities, it makes so much sense to provide the ability, at least for that data ownership, for the ability to own your own education, to help self-govern that education.
Thanks very much, Beth. Thank you to all three speakers. Thank you to everyone who took part. Back to you, Roxana.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And I think we've still got a holding slide on. I'm not sure. Okay, am I on now? Can you hear me, Barbara?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Barbara, and the panel. I think it's been extremely interesting and really assuring insights indeed about data privacy and SSI and ownership. Great examples as well. I think it's a topic that perhaps we could consider workshopping as we move forward, and with the PSET Cloud, maybe post-conference, but maybe everyone should watch the space. So, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have to close the session, and my apologies that we do have to come back at 12:15. That just gives you a quick comfort break. But bear in mind, we've got one more session after that at 12:15 when you return, and then we have a close out. So if you could just bear with us and come back by 12:15. Thank you very much, everyone.